Good afternoon. My name is Amanda Friedman, and I'm the Associate Director of Education at the Illinois Holocaust Museum. We are proud to partner with the Alabama Holocaust Education Center and Holocaust centers and museums around the country on the What History Teaches: The Rise of Nazism series. During today's talk, Isolationism, Immigration, and the World Watching, we will explore how the U.S. government and individual Americans reacted to Hitler's rise to power and the persecution of Jews, the clash between isolationist sentiment and moral responsibility, and how choices in Washington, D.C. shaped lives across the Atlantic. As we as a country grapple with questions around immigration, a particularly pressing topic in Chicago and other cities in recent weeks and months, and our relationships with other nations, the lessons we can draw from this history seem as urgent today as they've ever been. Guiding us through this history today is Dr. Daniel Greene, Adjunct Professor of History at Northwestern University and curator of the acclaimed Americans and the Holocaust exhibition at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and historical advisor on the PBS documentary The U.S. and the Holocaust by Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and Sarah Botstein. We will have time for Dr. Greene to take questions at the end of today's program. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask your question, and we will get to as many as we can in the available time. Dr. Greene, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Amanda. And I want to thank the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center for inviting me to speak today. As Amanda said, our focus this afternoon is on the United States during the period between World War I and World War II, and especially the period when the Nazis were in power from 1933 to 1945. We're going to look at how the U.S. responded to Nazism and specifically ask why it was so difficult for refugees to immigrate to the United States during this period. And this topic speaks to two enduring questions in U.S. history. The first is, when and why does the United States decide to get involved in international crises abroad, including war? And the second is, how do Americans understand and debate their responsibilities to people who are fleeing from persecution abroad? Sorry about that. Americans' response to Nazism is shaped in part by domestic conditions in the United States. Here we see immigrants arriving in New York Harbor. You can see the Statue of Liberty and the fog in the background. Immigration policies in the United States that came before Nazis would shape our response to Nazism during the 1930s and 40s. There were multiple changes to immigration policy in the United States from the 19-teens through 1924, at which time a restrictive immigration law known as the National Origins Quota Act or the Johnson-Reed Act was passed. And that 1924 law would be on the books in the United States for decades. And of course, 1924 is 9 years before the Nazis come to power in 1933. Many students that I teach often think that we changed our immigration policies or restricted immigration policies in response to Nazism, but it's important to say that these restrictive policies were on the books before the rise of Nazism. And so, although the United States is often described as a nation of immigrants, it's also true that the United States has made efforts to close its doors to immigrants throughout its history. Both things are true, that the U.S. conceives of itself as a nation of immigrants and that it has passed restrictive immigration laws during its history. During the early part of the 20th century, we see the rise of social scientists who start to describe immigration as a problem. This leads Congress to establish the Dillingham Commission in 1907. The Dillingham Commission is also known as the United States Immigration Commission. This was a bipartisan special committee formed in 1907 by the United States Congress and President Theodore Roosevelt to study the origins and the consequences of recent immigration to the United States. And the Dillingham Commission concluded by 1911 that immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe posed a serious threat to American society and culture, and therefore should be greatly reduced. The commission's overall findings provided the rationale for the politically and economically inspired immigration restriction acts of the 1920s, including the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, which favored immigration from Northern and Western Europe by restricting the annual number of immigrants from any given country to 3% of the total number of people living in the United States from that country in 1910. So here you see a political cartoon from May of 1921 that's showing Uncle Sam kind of guarding this funnel of a mass of immigrants who want to be in. And you can see he's holding that card at the gate that indicates only 3% of the total number of people from a certain country that were living in the United States in 1910 would be let in. So this movement for immigration restriction that the Dillingham Commission helped to stimulate then culminated in the National Origins Formula of 1924. And that formula caps immigration at 150,000 people annually, roughly, and bars immigration from Asia altogether. The 1924 law also lowers the existing quota from 3%, as it had been from 1921, to 2%. And it decides to base the quota calculations not on the census from 1910, but on the census from 1890. So this is a way that Congress is trying to have further restriction and trying to make sure that more of the immigrants who come from Europe are going to be coming from Northern and Western Europe than from Southern and Eastern Europe. President Calvin Coolidge signs the act on the White House lawn in 1924, and banner headlines like this one from the Kalamazoo, Michigan Gazette call the immigration measure an exclusion bill. All of these measures in the 1924 Immigration Act aim to preserve homogeneity in the U.S. population. This is Washington, D.C. in 1925. We see the Ku Klux Klan marching outside the U.S. Capitol. Organizations like the KKK, which terrorized African Americans, Catholics, Jews, and immigrants, also aimed to preserve this imagined homogeneity through violence. So this vision of the United States is being quote, preserved both in law and then often through extra legal violence as well. In addition to restrictive immigration, the history of U.S. involvement in World War I shaped Americans' understanding of the world. So here you see a wounded World War I veteran on the street in Philadelphia during the 1930s. He's lost his eyesight and he's selling newspapers on the street to earn a living. Many Americans were shocked by the catastrophes of World War I. And the lesson that they took away was that the United States should avoid wars in the future. In public opinion polls during the 1930s, it was common for about 70% of Americans to say that entering World War I had been a mistake. Again, common for about 70% of Americans to say that entering World War I had been a mistake. Now, 4.7 million Americans had served in World War I. More than 116,000 died, and approximately 320,000 were either sick or wounded by World War I. The U.S. actually lost a great deal of personnel to disease, about 63,000 due to the influenza epidemic of 1918 as well. So families visiting the graves of lost soldiers, like we see here in this photograph, was common in the 1920s as the Nazis were rising in Germany, and then in the 1930s as the Nazis were in power. American perception of the world was also shaped by fear and concern about continuing economic depression. This is a soup kitchen in my hometown of Chicago. In 1933, you see people lined up to get free soup and free food. The Great Depression was a severe worldwide economic disintegration that symbolized in the United States by the stock market crash in October 1929. By the time that President Franklin D. Roosevelt took office on March 4th of 1933, the banking system had collapsed and 25% of working age Americans were unemployed. This was the worst economic disaster in American history that people living at that time had ever known. Farm prices fell so drastically that many farmers lost their homes and their lands. And the depression lasted for many years, and even moments of recovery that occurred over time were not linear. So we have anti-immigrant sentiment, isolation, and economic depression that combine to make the United States much more reluctant to admit immigrants. In 1907, we see the peak of US immigration with more than 1.2 million immigrants entering the United States that year. 1907, more than 1.2 million immigrants enter the United States at a time when the US population was about 87 million people. Immigration then drops precipitously during World War I in the late 19 teens. The Johnson-Reed immigration law of 1924 saw immigration capped, as I said, at approximately 150,000 annually, but the actual number of immigrants who are going to enter the United States was often far below that cap. And so you would see headlines like this in 1924, that America of the melting pot has come to an end. Then, with the Depression beginning in 1929 and President Hoover emphasizing a clause in the immigration law, the likely to become a public charge clause that I'll say more about today, immigration to the United States bottoms out at about 35,000 by 1929. Remember, it had peaked at 1.2 million in 1907. During this time, we also see hundreds of thousands of Mexican Americans either voluntarily leaving the US because of lack of economic opportunity during the Depression or being deported by the US government. So all of these things, all of these conditions in the United States are precursors to Hitler coming to power in January of 1933. And as we all know, the Nazis aimed to make Germany Judenrein, cleansed of Jews, by making life so difficult for them that they'd be forced to leave the country. By 1938, about 150,000 German Jews, or 1 in 4 Jews living in Germany, had already fled the country. But after Germany annexes Austria in the spring of 1938, an additional roughly 192,000 Jews are brought under Nazi rule, and many Jews are unable to find countries willing to take them in. In the summer of 1938, delegates from 32 countries meet at the French resort of Evian to discuss this refugee problem. President Roosevelt chose not to send a high-level official, such as the Secretary of State, to the Evian conference. Instead, he sends Myron C. Taylor, a businessman and close friend of Roosevelt's, who represents the U.S. at the Evian conference. During the meeting, which lasts 9 days, delegate after delegate rises to express sympathy for refugees. But most countries, including the United States and Britain, then offer excuses for not letting in more refugees. With the exception of the Dominican Republic, no country at the Evian conference was willing to accept more refugees. However, one result of the conference at Evian was the establishment of what's known as the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees, which would continue to work on the refugee problem. So this headline, chronicling the yes, but attitude at Evian, speaks to the fact that there was sympathy expressed for the refugees, but it came without action on behalf of the refugees. And it's important to note here that the United States had no refugee policy or asylum policy in the 1930s and 40s. Refugees who were fleeing persecution had to follow the process that any other prospective immigrant had to follow. And that process was complicated and it was bureaucratic, and it was designed to be that way. Under US and international law, now we understand that refugees are people fleeing persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution due to race, due to membership in a particular social group, political opinion, religion, or national origins. And while refugees have come to the United States since its founding, the Displaced Persons Act of 1948 was the country's first official refugee law. Before that time, including during the mass murder of the Holocaust, refugee is not a category in US law. Responding to the conference proceedings in Evian, the German government was then able to state, really with great pleasure, how astounding it was that foreign countries criticized Germany for their treatment of Jews, but none of them wanted to open the doors to Jews when the opportunity offered. So you start to see political cartoons like this from Herbert Bloch, who was known, a cartoonist known as Herr Bloch, this cartoon comes 6 months, this political cartoon comes 6 months after the Evian conference. It's called Still No Solution, stating that there's still no solution to this looming refugee problem as world state leaders debate the problem as the refugee problem looms. This is Dorothy Thompson, a prominent American reporter, columnist, and radio personality. And throughout the 1930s and 40s, she urges Americans to pay attention to the threat that Nazi Germany poses to democracy and poses to Europe's Jews. In 1938, just after the Evian conference had been called, but before it had taken place, Thompson writes a short book called Refugees, Anarchy or Organization. And in this book, she lays out the challenges facing refugees from both the Spanish Civil War and from the Nazi regime. And she urges Americans to see that immigrants could boost the American economy, which is still depressed in 1938. And you can see here in this quote that she's emphasizing the challenging bureaucracy that immigrants to the United States had to navigate. She says it's a fantastic commentary on the inhumanity of our times, that for thousands and thousands of people, a piece of paper with a stamp on it is the difference between life and death. What's she talking about? She's talking about everything that was required to obtain a U.S. immigration visa during this period. The bureaucratic hurdles facing German Jews who were attempting to immigrate to the United States in the 1930s were overwhelming. These nations required extensive documentation that was often very, very difficult to obtain. These forms could be expensive. Sometimes they had short windows of opportunity, meaning they would have an expiration date. And prospective immigrants had to line up documents in the right order at the right time in this particular order. So you can see here that prospective immigrants needed visa applications. They needed a birth certificate. They needed to obtain a quota number that would establish their place on a waiting list for a visa. They needed sponsors in the United States who would guarantee that they weren't what was called likely to become a public charge, meaning that they could take care of themselves economically, or that they wouldn't become a drain on the depressed U.S. economy. The State Department looked more favorably on sponsors who were relatives rather than acquaintances or friends, or even business associates. And then people needed a host of supporting documents: federal tax returns, affidavits from banks, affidavits of good conduct, certificates of good conduct from the German police authorities, a physical examination, because one way to understand the immigration is a concern about the health of the state, right? So that healthy people had to be coming in so as not to threaten the health of the state. The immigrants needed proof that they had permission to leave Germany, and they needed proof that they had booked passage to the Western Hemisphere, and booking passage could be quite expensive as well. And then a few months after the Evian conference, the situation worsened significantly. Here you're seeing a headline from the Dallas Morning News from November of 1938. As many of us know, on the night of November 9th and 10th of 1938, Nazi German leaders unleashed a nationwide anti-Jewish riot across Germany and the former Austria. The violence was supposed to look like it was an unplanned outburst of anger, popular anger against Jews, but in reality, we know that this was state-sponsored vandalism and terror. During Kristallnacht, Nazis burned more than 1,400 synagogues. They vandalized thousands of Jewish-owned businesses, broke into Jews' apartments and their homes, and desecrated Jewish religious objects. They also humiliated, assaulted, and killed Jewish people. In the aftermath of Kristallnacht, the Nazi regime orders the Jewish community to pay a 1 billion Reichsmarks they call it an atonement payment, and the regime also rapidly enacts many anti-Jewish laws and decrees. So Kristallnacht tightens the vice for Jews who are trying to get out of Germany. And we see it as banner headlines in the United States. This is the Dallas Morning News. This is how the Chicago Daily Tribune reported it on November 15th. They focused on Jews seeking to leave Germany in the aftermath of the violence. Even 2 weeks after Kristallnacht, front page stories like this one in the Los Angeles Examiner focused on the unwillingness of nations throughout the world to admit Jews within their borders. You can see here on the right, Nazis warn world Jews will be wiped out unless evacuated by democracies. In the weeks after Kristallnacht, Americans were asked in a series of public opinion polls about the Nazi regime's actions. And those public opinion polls revealed that 96% of Americans indicated that they disapproved of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany. And yet, when they were asked in a follow-up question whether the United States should allow more exiles from Germany to come to the United States to live, 72% say no. So 96% of Americans disapprove of Nazism, and 72% of those Americans don't want to let in more exiles from Germany. And again, that's an echo of that Evian conference. We see sympathy expressed for refugees, but a reluctance to take action on behalf of Jews who want to make it to the United States, not only within the US government, but among the American populace as well. We start to see graphics like this in American newspapers. This is from the Oakland, California Tribune on November 27th, 1938, so roughly 2 weeks after the attacks of Kristallnacht. And this illustrates the ways that the existing U.S. immigration quotas, again, that were established in 1924, hamper Jews' opportunity to enter the United States in any great mass. Under each country, you see two numbers, and the number on the left of the dash is an estimate of the number of Jews living in those countries at that moment. And the estimates here are pretty good. Poland, for example, says 3.25 million. Hungary says 444,000. The German estimate of 550,000 is actually too high. That's a good estimate for 1933, and this is a 1938 graphic. As I mentioned earlier, some Jews had been able to leave Germany. But then go to the right of the dash under each country, and you see a much smaller number. That number is the number of visas that could be issued under the existing U.S. immigration quota to people born in that country per year. So again, this is the number established by the 1924 restrictive immigration quota law. It's the number of visas that could be issued annually to people born in that country who wanted to come to the United States. As you can see, it's obvious that this number shrinks as you move east and south in Europe. And those are the lands where most of the Jews live and the lands where significant killing will take place during the Holocaust. Now, even if the United States had issued all the visas that it could have under these restrictive immigration laws, that would not have prevented the Holocaust. However, in most years between 1933 and 1945, the U.S. significantly underissues the visas it could have, even under these existing restrictive U.S. immigration laws. And there's so we have these quotas, but the quotas are maximums, and the State Department is often coming nowhere close to issuing the maximum number of visas that it could have every year. There's a combination of factors that's responsible for this. We should resist the idea that there's only one explanation for why visas were so underissued. These reasons include concerns about economic depression. They include isolation from world affairs. They include xenophobia and anti-Semitism in the State Department and elsewhere in the U.S. government. And they include an unwillingness of President Roosevelt to speak out for action or to order any action on behalf of Jews in Europe until very, very late in the war. There were some proposals to get around this, including a proposal before Congress in 1939 that's known as the Wagner-Rogers Bill. You're seeing the cover of the bill here, Admission of German Refugee Children. In February of 1939, Democratic Senator Robert Wagner of New York and Republican Congresswoman Edith Nourse Rogers of Massachusetts sponsor identical bills in the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. Sorry, Wagner's in the Senate, Rogers is in the House. The bills specify that 10,000 children under the age of 14 would enter the United States for 2 fiscal years, 1939 and 1940, so 20,000 children total, and that they would not be counted against the existing immigration quotas. The bills don't indicate that the German refugee children that you see here in the title would be mostly Jewish children, but the realities of the refugee crisis in Europe make this obvious and they make it an understood fact. The bills specify that when the refugee children reach the age of 18, they would either be counted against that year's German quota, the year they turn 18, or they would be returned to Europe. Now, the leaders of American Jewish organizations rarely lobby for this bill publicly. They may have been concerned that any attempt to prioritize Jewish refugee children would spark increased anti-Semitism at a moment of heightened anti-Semitism in the United States. Senator Wagner and Congresswoman Rogers were not Jewish, and they emphasized that their bill would admit both Jewish and Christian children. But the opponents of the bill brand this legislation as an effort primarily to help Jewish refugee children. For the first time in her 6 years as First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt allows reporters to quote her in support of pending legislation. The First Lady refers to the ongoing Kindertransport, which had brought German refugee children to Great Britain and Western Europe. And she says England, France, and the Scandinavian countries are taking their share of these children, and I think we should. You can see here also that she refers to the bill as a wise way to do a humanitarian act. Despite his wife's urging, President Roosevelt never publicly commented on the Wagner-Rogers bill. Democratic Senator Robert Reynolds of North Carolina actively opposes the Wagner-Rogers bill. He gives multiple speeches against the bill on the Senate floor, and he asks constituents to voice their opposition. Reynolds warned that admitting refugees, even children, would increase unemployment. And at this point, Reynolds himself had already introduced 5 separate proposals in Congress to limit immigration. One proposal would have banned immigration for either for 10 years or until the unemployment rate had dropped to historically low levels. And more Americans agree with Reynolds than agree with Eleanor Roosevelt. In a public opinion poll in January of 1939, 2/3 of Americans indicate that they're against the proposal in the Wagner-Rogers bill. During the summer of 1939, the Senate Committee on Immigration then proposes amending the bill to count the 20,000 German refugee children within the quota system. Remember, it was going to be outside the quota system. Robert Reynolds proposed allowing the children to enter in exchange for ending all quota immigration for 5 years. So no immigration to the United States for 5 years. And Senator Wagner from New York refuses to accept either compromise, and he withdraws the bill from consideration. So neither the Senate or the House ever put the Wagner-Rogers bill to a vote, and it never becomes law. At the same time that the Wagner-Rogers bill is failing, this ship, the MSS St. Louis, is out at sea. In May of 1939, the German liner St. Louis had sailed from Hamburg to Havana, Cuba. There were 937 passengers on board. Almost all were Jewish refugees. Most were German citizens. Some were from Eastern Europe, and a few were considered officially stateless. The majority of Jewish passengers had applied for U.S. visas and had planned to stay in Cuba only until they could enter the United States. But after the St. Louis arrives in Havana, the passengers learn that the Cuban government had canceled their landing permits. And a combination of money and corruption and internal power struggles were at work in Cuba. Like the United States and the Americas in general, Cuba was struggling through a depression, and many Cubans resented the relatively large number of refugees whom the government had already admitted to the country. There were about 2,500 Jews who had already been admitted because they were perceived as competitors for scarce jobs. Hostility towards immigrants fuels anti-Semitism and xenophobia in Cuba at this time, and both agents of Nazi Germany and local right-wing movements are stoking anti-Jewish sentiment in Cuba, especially claiming that Jews are communists. So when the St. Louis arrives in Havana on May 27th of 1939, the Cuban government admits 28 passengers, 22 of whom were Jewish, and six others, four were Spanish and two were Cuban nationals. They all had valid entry documents, those 28 out of 937. One further passenger who had attempted to die by suicide on the boat was evacuated to a hospital in Havana. But the remaining 908 passengers on the ship had been awaiting entry visas. They only carried Cuban transit visas, and the Cuban government refuses to admit them. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or the Joint, negotiates with Cuba on behalf of the passengers, but the negotiations fail, and the Cuban government forces the ship to leave the harbor. The ship sails along the Florida coast for some time, but the U.S. government does not allow the passengers to land since they didn't have U.S. immigration visas and they had not passed a security screening. Here you're seeing some of the passengers on the boat. After Cuba denies entry to the passengers on the St. Louis, the press throughout Europe and the Americas, including in the United States, brings the story to millions of readers throughout the world. They were sailing so close to the Florida coast that they could see the lights of Miami. Some of the passengers on the St. Louis send telegrams to President Franklin D. Roosevelt asking for refuge, but Roosevelt never responds to those telegrams. The State Department and the White House decide to not take any extraordinary measures to permit the refugees to enter the United States. A State Department telegram that was sent to a passenger stated that passengers must, quote, await their turns on the waiting list and qualify for and obtain immigration visas before they may be admissible to the United States. So following the U.S. government's refusal to permit the passengers to disembark, the St. Louis sails back to Europe on June 6th of 1939. Ultimately, the passengers don't return to Germany. Jewish organizations, especially the Joint, negotiate with four European governments to secure entry visas for these passengers, and they land in Great Britain, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Over time, of course, some of those countries will become Nazi occupied, and 254 passengers from the St. Louis are killed during the Holocaust. This is a big story in the voyage of the St. Louis is a story in the United States as it's happening. Here you see this political cartoon from the New York Daily Mirror, penned by Fred Packer. It ran on June 6th of 1939, the day that the St. Louis heads back to Europe. And you see it shows a Jewish refugee ship, the St. Louis, traveling away from the United States as the Statue of Liberty turns her head and holds a keep out sign, turning her head away in shame. Just the day before this Fred Packer cartoon was published, Life magazine celebrated the completion of a multi-year refurbishment of the Statue of Liberty by the National Park Service. So on the left is June 6th, 1939. On the right is the cover of Life magazine from June 5th, 1939. These two images, one of Lady Liberty with her head turned away from refugees, and one as Lady Liberty as a beacon of welcome, sum up the contradictions of American ideals and American practices during the late 1930s. The U.S. adheres to strict quotas, and the U.S. touts itself as a nation of immigrants. And it's important to note here that the St. Louis is often talked about as if it was the only ship that tried to get into the United States during this period, and that's incorrect. It may be the best remembered ship, especially because its story is so anomalous. But between 1938 and 1941, more than 1,200 ships carrying more than 110,000 Jewish refugees landed in the port of New York alone. So the doors to the United States were not entirely closed, but the U.S. issued far fewer visas than it could have, even under its restrictive immigration laws. During the Nazi period, the United States admitted more refugees than any other Allied country. Historians debate the exact numbers, but a fair estimate is that roughly 225,000 Jewish refugees were admitted to the United States between 1933 and 1945. Not nearly as many as could have been admitted under restrictive immigration quotas, but more than any other Allied nation. Now, I want to shift to talking a little bit about isolation as well. World War II begins in Europe on September 1st of 1939. Americans had been anticipating war for quite a while by this point. Here, the Chicago Sunday Tribune is giving the headline of Britain going to war. The United States already had a strong strain of isolationism in its political culture. Seeing Europe go to war increases the urgency for isolationists to make their case. 2 days after Germany invades Poland, Great Britain and France declare war on Germany, and President Roosevelt takes to the airwaves in a fireside chat to assure Americans, as you can see here, as he says, that this nation will remain a neutral nation. But many Americans did not trust FDR's promise. Over the next 2 years, FDR's administration would work to overturn the neutrality legislation that had been passed multiple times by Congress during the 1930s. Americans also saw FDR push to help arm nations that were fighting the Nazis through policies like the Lend-Lease Act, which became law in March of 1941. That act permitted the United States to extend material aid to the Allies before and after the United States entered World War II. Lend-Lease cements the role of the United States as what FDR calls the arsenal of democracy, a key phrase that he explained to Americans in a fireside chat in December of 1940. As FDR is working to overturn neutrality legislation and pass the Lend-Lease Act, he faces opposition from isolationists in the United States. The America First Committee became the most influential isolationist organization in the United States during this era. And here you see Charles Lindbergh on the left and R. Douglas Stewart Jr. on the right. In June of 1940, a group of law school students at Yale University in Connecticut, including Douglas Stewart here on the right, formed the America First Committee as an anti-war organization. They encouraged the United States to build a strong defense at home, but to stay out of the fighting in Europe. And the America First Committee establishes a number of principles, including building what they call an impregnable defense for America, staying prepared for an attack by a foreign power, staying out of war in Europe, and not sending any weapons or aid to warring nations abroad. The America First Committee becomes an influential organization. They quickly have 450 chapters across the country and about 850,000 members. About 2/3 of those members are concentrated in the Midwest of the United States. And they establish a Department of Research and a Speakers Bureau to support and publicize their cause. They hold rallies, they publish materials to educate readers, they place ads in local newspapers, they sponsor radio broadcasts, and they focus on cultivating local leadership. They often hearken back to U.S. losses in World War I. Here you see American dead, World War I, 50,475, and the number of wounded. This is recruitment on the streets of Chicago in March of 1941 for the America First Committee. Some of their propaganda, like this poster, show a missile going through the arm of the Statue of Liberty, suggesting that the first casualty of war would be liberty itself. The U.S. government pays close attention to the America First Committee from its founding. The Roosevelt administration secretly orders the FBI to monitor America First activities. And the FBI can't prove that the America First Committee was subversive, but it reports that there may be fascist sympathizers who have infiltrated the America First Committee. And the America First Committee has trouble countering claims that it was an anti-Semitic organization because some openly anti-Semitic speakers and organizations supported it. For example, before the Ku Klux Klan, the Ku Klux Klan and the Silver Shirts or the Silver Legion endorse the America First Committee. Father Charles Coughlin, the popular anti-Semitic radio priest from Royal Oak, Michigan, urges his listeners to join the America First Committee. And then here we see the German-American Bund, a pro-Nazi U.S. organization that also tells its members to join the America First Committee. Charles Lindbergh, seen here, was the most well-known spokesperson for the America First Committee. He's an aviation hero, and he's one of the most famous Americans of his time. His isolationist stance had been well known, but at an America First Committee rally in September 1941 in Des Moines, Iowa, he gives a speech titled, "Who Are the War Agitators?" And in this speech, he accuses the British, Jewish people and President Roosevelt of pushing the United States to enter the war. He threatens Jews in the United States, saying that there'll be a backlash of anti-Semitism if the United States enters this war. And then he repeats multiple conspiratorial ideas about Jews, saying that the Jews pose a great danger to the United States because of, quote, their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government. After he gives this war agitator speech, Lindbergh is accused of anti-Semitism, and many people start to ask publicly whether Lindbergh himself is a Nazi. The press reaction to Lindbergh's speech is resoundingly negative. Here you see a political cartoon drawn by Theodore Geisel, or known as Dr. Seuss. This is from PM Magazine in September of 1941, and you can see that a mother is reading, wearing an America First sweater, is reading a terrifying story to her children. The story is called Adolf the Wolf, and it reads, "And the wolf chewed up their children and spit out their bones, but those were foreign children, and it didn't really matter." So the United States is caught up 1939, 1940, and 1941 in this intense debate between isolationism and intervention. It's often seen as a debate between Lindbergh and President Roosevelt himself, and this debate is only settled by Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The next day, the U.S. enters the war against Japan. Germany declares war on the United States. Just a few days later, on December 11th, 1941, 4 days after this, the leaders of the America First Committee vote to dissolve their organization. In a fireside chat on December 9th, FDR tells Americans, "We're now in this war. We're all in it, all the way. Every single man, woman, and child is a partner in the most tremendous undertaking of our American history." When the United States enters the war in 1941, more than 1.5 million Jews already had been murdered in the Holocaust by bullets on the Eastern Front. The US government knew about this systematic killing. By the time we get to D-Day, shown here, June 6, 1944, more than 5 million Jews had been murdered already. 16 million Americans serve in World War II, and more than 400,000 Americans die in World War II. But the US does not make rescuing Jews a priority in this battle. It's natural to ask, what more might Americans have done? Beyond the military goal of defeating Nazism, the United States could have publicized information about Nazi atrocities that they had. They could have pressured other allies and neutral nations to help endangered Jews, and they could have supported resistance groups against the Nazis. Prior to the war, the United States government could have enlarged or filled its immigration quotas to allow more Jewish refugees to enter the country. Now, these acts together would not have prevented the Holocaust, but they likely would have reduced the death toll. Here we see a U.S. soldier with liberated prisoners in the Mauthausen concentration camp. This is May of 1945. As U.S. and Allied troops moved across Europe against Nazi Germany, they encountered concentration camps and other sites of Nazi crimes. Liberation of Nazi camps was not a primary objective of the Allied military campaign, but U.S., British, Canadian, Soviet, and other troops freed prisoners, provided aid to survivors, and collected evidence. Here you see General Dwight D. Eisenhower with his hands on his hips just to the right of the center of the image. He's the Supreme Allied Commander, and this is Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald. It's April 12th of 1945. Eisenhower is appalled by what he's seeing at Ohrdruf, and he's also concerned immediately that these crimes might one day be denied. He requests that U.S. Congress officials and that U.S. newspaper editors tour the camp, which did happen, and he also makes sure that German civilians tour the camp to see the atrocities that occurred there. Eisenhower says in a letter back to General Marshall on April 15, 1945, the visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were overpowering. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence of these things, if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. So Eisenhower already, as he's seeing these crimes before the war has even ended, is concerned about denial of these crimes. Some significant changes to U.S. immigration policy do come in the wake of the Holocaust. This is President Truman, and with Truman's encouragement, Congress passes limited legislation to aid European displaced persons, including Holocaust survivors. Faced with congressional inaction, Truman issued an executive order known as the Truman Directive in December of 1945. The directive requires that existing immigration quotas be designated for displaced persons. While overall immigration to the United States did not increase, more DPs, more displaced persons were admitted than had been before. About 22,900 displaced persons, among whom two-thirds were Jewish, enter the United States between December of 1945 and 1947 under the provisions of the Truman Directive. Now, Truman alone could not raise restrictive U.S. or British immigration quotas, but he does succeed in pressuring Great Britain into sponsoring the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry. And this is a binational delegation whose suggestions included admission of 100,000 Jewish displaced persons to British Mandate Palestine at the time. Congress also passes the Displaced Persons Act in 1948, authorizing 200,000 displaced persons to enter the United States. The law's stipulations at first made it unfavorable to Jewish displaced persons, but Congress amends the bill with the DP Act of 1950. And by 1952, more than 80,000 Jewish displaced persons had immigrated to the United States under the terms of the Displaced Persons Act and with the aid of Jewish organizations. Pressures that President Truman put on a reluctant Congress and reluctant allies were critical in these Holocaust survivors' ability to make it to the United States. But in a public opinion poll in December of 1945, the same moment as the Truman Directive, and 6 months after the war in Europe had ended, Americans were asked what they thought of opening the doors to the United States to more people who were fleeing Europe. Only 5% of Americans indicated that they thought more people should be allowed into the country each year. 37% of Americans said that fewer people should be allowed in, that the number of immigrants should be reduced. Skipping ahead, on October 3rd, 1965, at the base of the Statue of Liberty, President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the Immigration and Nationality Act, also known as the Hart-Celler Act. In his first State of the Union in January of 1964, just 2 months after taking office, Johnson called on Congress to reject the national origins quotas from 1924. Johnson said, "A nation that was built by the immigrants of all lands can ask those who now seek immigration, 'What can you do for your country?' But we should not be asking, 'In what country were you born?'" The Immigration Act of 1965 abolished the quota system from 1924 and eliminated the formally racial character of immigration to the United States. Rather than discriminating on the basis of ethnicity or race, the law authorized 120,000 immigration visas for people from the Western Hemisphere and 170,000 visas for people from the Eastern Hemisphere. It also prioritizes keeping families together, and it puts a preference on skilled workers. Johnson remarked here in 1965, and you can see him at the base of the Statue of Liberty. Johnson remarked that the Immigration Act of 1965, quote, "does repair a very deep flaw in the fabric of American injustice. It corrects a cruel and enduring wrong in the conduct of the American nation." I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Danny, thank you. That was a lot to take in. Very informative. We have a few questions that have come in so far. If anyone else in the audience would like to ask a question, please type it in at the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. How did public opinion polls toward immigration change after the war, and particularly once knowledge of the Holocaust became more widespread?
It's a great question, Amanda, and we'd love to, I think, live in a place where understanding or at least seeing some of the crimes of the Holocaust and some of the atrocities of the Holocaust would have made Americans more willing to open their doors and also to see anti-Semitism decrease. But in fact, I think neither of those things are true. I think that public opinion poll from December of 1945 that I cited is so important because it's 6 months after the end of the war in Europe. Now, Americans have a lot of information, access to a lot of information about the persecution and murder of Jews as it's happening. They don't have a lot of visual evidence until very, very late in the war. Newsreels and Life magazine pictures that come in, say, April and May of 1945 show Americans so many of the images that we today associate with the atrocities of the Holocaust. So we had information without, for the most part, without images. Those images, I think, do change understanding. I mean, even Eisenhower is appalled at what he's seen. He has access to more information, arguably, than anyone. One of the things that Eisenhower says when he's at Ordruff in April of 1945 that really stands out to me, that I didn't cite in the talk, he says, everything that we've read to date has been an understatement. So what he's seeing is worse than what he's heard. So then you would think, once Americans see the visual evidence of these crimes, that they might be more prone to change their ideas about immigration. But it's just not true in those immediate years. As I said, only 5% of Americans in that December of 1945 poll want to let more refugees in. 37% want to let fewer refugees in. And Truman is really battling with Congress for years, not only to get a Displaced Persons Act passed, but to say that there should be a percentage, a high percentage of the slots in the Displaced Persons Act reserved for Jewish victims, or for Jewish DPs. But it's very difficult for him to make that case. So I think it's a way in American history that we see how entangled anti-Semitism can be with U.S. immigration policy.
Absolutely. Changing gears slightly, would you say that Roosevelt's attitudes toward Jews and intervening in the war and in the Holocaust were grounded in political expediency, in anti-Semitism? Where would you kind of strike that balance?
I think some of the best scholars of Roosevelt out there, one of the things that is clear about Roosevelt is he wants to fight political battles that he knows he can win. I think one of his worst moments as president before the war is the court packing scandal in 1937 when he tries to add seats to the Supreme Court. It goes very badly for him. He then loses really significant ground in the midterms in his second term in November 1938, which incidentally is the same week as Kristallnacht, those midterms. And FDR scholars that I've read that I find convincing say that what did he learn at that moment? He learned pick fights you can win. And I think what we see with Roosevelt in between 1939 and 1941 is he's going to spend all his political capital on trying to move the U.S. away from neutrality towards Lend-Lease, towards intervention in this war, because it's a battle that he thinks is winnable. I think he thinks that immigration is not a battle that's winnable, and we don't see him spend any political capital on immigration. Roosevelt has access to information about what's happening to Jews, and we don't see significant action until very, very late in the war. I didn't talk about this at all, but with the founding of the War Refugee Board, which comes not only, in an executive order quite late in the war, a body, an interagency body in the United States government, whose charge is to help Jews as long as it doesn't impede the war effort. And I think one of the things that's so difficult to understand about this, or so unsettling to understand about this, is that in Roosevelt's White House, there's a kind of locked down logic that the way you stop the killing is you stop the killers. And that when there are proposals for rescue of the victims, in their language, they see it as a diversion from the war effort. Now, that might lead to some moral outrage about the Roosevelt administration's response, and I understand that, but we also have to struggle as historians with what they did. And what they did was prioritize U.S. entrance into the war and never prioritize trying to change U.S. immigration policy. It was an unwinnable battle.
Mhm. Thank you. Um, an easy question for a historian. How do the effects of the U.S. immigration policies during the Holocaust inform our immigration policies today?
Well, in some ways, yeah, not an easy question. In some ways, there are significant parts of the world order that are shaped in the aftermath of the Holocaust, right? In in post-war trials, in post-war changes to understanding of crimes against humanity, in post-war changes regarding the category of refugee in U.S. law and international law and the understanding of asylum, right? Those passengers on the St. Louis could not land on American shores and claim asylum. That didn't exist. And this is especially quite confusing for students. It didn't exist in law. This is especially quite confusing for students because the language of the day uses the word asylum and it uses the word refugee. Sometimes it refers, we often refer, the American press will often refer to Jews trying to make it to the United States as refugees, but they had to come here as immigrants
Mhm.
under this restrictive, xenophobic, in part anti-Semitic restrictive immigration law. And so one of the ways that our understanding today is shaped is we get these new categories in law that didn't exist. And had those categories existed in law, I don't think it would have prevented the Holocaust, but tens of thousands, if not more, lives could have been saved.
Mhm. Thank you. Um, we have a question about Eisenhower's concern for denial and the lack of appreciation, I guess you could say, for the barbarity of the concentration camps. Um, where do you, since that was not necessarily the way that his peers and his colleagues were seeing um, were seeing the aftermath, where do you think that came from for Eisenhower? Why was he the one?
I don't know that Eisenhower is alone in
Mhm.
that. Where where is it coming from? It's difficult as a historian to do that kind of psychohistory, right? And to get into people's motivations or beliefs. I think we can appreciate how important it was that Eisenhower made the decision to go see those camps, to go witness them, and to bear witness, as we say, right? In his, but it's certainly true that not all generals see this. See this in the same way that Eisenhower does. It reminds me of a question we also often ask of rescuers. And I didn't talk about America. There are Americans who rescue refugees. Some take significant financial risks. Some risk their lives to aid refugees. It's often tough to get at their motivation. Sometimes with religious leaders, they'll talk about it being a mission of their religion, whether they're Jewish or otherwise. But others will say, oh, well, it was the right thing to do. And I think that this is an example, this question is an example of how the Holocaust, how studying the Holocaust can get at some very difficult, very
Mhm.
challenging, but deeply relevant parts of human nature and human behavior. And leadership is one of them, right? And I think Eisenhower at that moment is showing effective leadership. I think I'm speculating here, so I'm reluctant to say it, but I would imagine he not only is thinking of himself as an individual, but thinking about what he represents as an American soldier, as part of the Allied Supreme Command, right? And that it is bigger than himself. I don't know that I could point to Eisenhower saying that, or that I've seen a document where Eisenhower says that, but it's something I think worth speculating about.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We are about out of time, but as a final kind of closing question, the title of this lecture series is What History Teaches. So what is something that you hope that we as Americans learn from this particular history?
Well, I think, one of the themes that I hope that people saw run through this, um, is that Americans were, in the main, were filled with sympathy for refugees, but not action on behalf of refugees, right? So I think one of the difficult things, one of the challenging things that studying the Holocaust, can teach us is how do we move from sympathy towards action? And action can be great or small. I'm not saying that action must mean risking your life for refugees, like some people, like some Americans and others did. But sympathy is not enough. I believe. I mean, we need to be informed. You need to be informed to have that kind of sympathy, but to be able to move from sympathy to real action, um, I think is one of the things. And then I think the other is, one of the tragedies of this history, specifically of Americans' response and Americans' immigration policy, excuse me, is that the United States could have done the most, I think, um, in that period between 1933 and 1938 by issuing more immigration visas, even under a very restrictive immigration law. By the time that Americans know that mass murder is happening, and that does become public information in the United States in 1942. Americans know this if they're reading the headlines by November of 1942. But by that point, it's almost impossible for individuals or organizations to be directly helping immigrants make it to the United States, right? So when we knew the least, and when sort of before the unimaginable had happened, the United States could have done so much more. And then by the time it learns that this mass murder is happening, what can the United States do? It can win the war, right? Which it does. And we make great sacrifices to win the war. And I'm not saying that to excuse American inaction. I'm not trying to make any excuses for American inaction on behalf of Jews in Europe, but just to struggle with that very difficult reality is one of the tragedies of this history, the specific American response to this history that really does stand out for me.
Right. That's even more for us to think about from your incredible lecture today. Thank you,
Thanks,
Dr.
Amanda.
Daniel Greene. Thank you to the Alabama Holocaust Education Center and all of the many Holocaust centers and museums around the country partnering on this important series. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.